Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I'm Dr. Işılay Gürsu,
I'm Dr. Peter Cherry.
and welcome to the Heritage Türkiye podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA. We are very, very happy to have Emma Baysal with us today. Emma is currently working at the Bilkent University's Archaeology Department, and she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the BIAA in 2012 and 2013, researching ornamentation practices.
And another really interesting thing about Emma is that she became a National Geographic Explorer in 2023 with her project Small Things, Big Stories, which she's going to talk to us about today. So, first of all, Emma, what is the National Geographic Explorer programme and how did you get involved?
First of all, it's really great to be here. The National Geographic Explorer programme it's a grant programme, so imagine as if it's an academic grant programme, but with some significant differences. So it invites people to think differently. It invites people to work much more broadly than normal academic programmes do, and it provides very different opportunities. So, for example, you can do storytelling rather than just academic research and publications. And they encourage people to think outside of the box. And they pick people who they see as possibly being a little bit different in the way they think or doing very new and interesting things or looking at the world from a completely different perspective. So I have colleagues in the programme who are photographers, who are town planners, who work in science communication, but not in academic science straightforwardly. So outside of the university environment. So we're not all academics.
Can we ask you a little bit about your project with the National Geographic, Small Things, Big Stories? How the name comes from and how did you get involved?
So I thought of that name quite a few years ago when I was doing a presentation about some burials from southeast Turkey from the Bronze Age. And I started thinking about how to make this accessible to people and how to make small artifacts in archaeology sound exciting, because they have a bit of an image problem. So I thought, okay, let's give it a catchy title. And I really enjoyed doing that presentation. It was about how actually the beads that those people had in the Bronze Age could tell us more than anything else about them, who they were, what their lives were like, why they were buried there, the ways that they were buried, and how important they might have been in the society of the time. So it was an important moment. And then I took that title from that and moved it on to some other stuff, because I mostly work on prehistoric material. So this project is about the Neolithic, specifically about the very earliest Neolithic settlements. And we're very lucky in Turkey that we have some of the world's very earliest villages here, and they're a great place to do research about how people perceived themselves in the very distant past. So we're talking up to 12,000 years ago and a bit earlier in the case of some of the places where I work.
Wow, that's very, very old. So, yes.
It is.
Yeah. So, as you said, you mostly work with ornaments. Can you tell us more about that? What is an ornament even, actually? Because we're not talking about the things that your grandma has.
Yeah, not the things that she has on her shelves. That is true. So I research personal ornaments. And the best way to think about it is that we all use them today. Everybody does in one way or another. So even maybe the glasses that you wear, you choose the color, you choose the frame, you decide what style you want to have. Earrings, makeup, tattoos, increasingly popular. Even your belt, for example, the color of the clothes that you wear, everything is part of the way that we present ourselves to the world and how we create our identities. And that's one of the things that makes us human. It's one of the things that humanity is based on, the idea that we want to affect the way that others view us and present a particular image to the world.
And can I just add to that then, so do you find most of the ornaments that you find, are they for utilitarian purposes or more kind of aesthetic enjoyment?
Yeah, that's an interesting and complicated question. So you can find things that are very much related to status, for example. Just like today, you might buy the biggest gold jewelry to show off your enormous wealth. You may have gems and, diamond rings. The engagement ring is a classic example. People compare how big their engagement ring is. It's a way of displaying status. So you might have that kind of approach. We also have a lot of ornaments that have meaning. And one of the examples I always use is evil eye beads, which are very, very common across the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean area. Still, they're a really common part of everyday life. And people use them sometimes for aesthetic purposes, but a lot of the time for belief-related purposes. And it's folk belief. So when a baby is born, people will often pin a little bead onto the clothes of the baby, possibly on their back. In Turkey, it's very common to do that. And that's to protect the baby and using that item as a means of protection because of the folk beliefs. There are lots and lots of other beliefs as well. Shells are regularly used. If you go to any tourist shop in Turkey, you can find things decorated with seashells. Those beliefs related to seashells go back actually way into the Paleolithic. So we're talking tens of thousands of years that people have been doing the same things. And so we're trying to understand that a bit and think about where these ideas came from and what drives us to do these. Why do we still keep doing them? We don't completely understand that. But many, many people have beliefs. You might have something you inherited from your grandma that you keep and look after. You might not even wear it. You might think it's a bit old-fashioned. But people will often keep things that are very meaningful to them. And we see really similar practices many thousands of years ago as well. So people keep things that are even broken and they look after them, put them away somewhere. Because we attribute meaning to the things we have. It's again, a fundamental part of being human.
Assigning very intangible value to something very material.
It's very difficult to record that in the archaeological record because we don't know what people were thinking in the past. It's very difficult to know what people were thinking in the past. But we do things like looking at how these ornaments were used. So if something's very old, and I mean old in the past, not obviously it's old today, it's already, maybe 10,000 years old, but also things can be old for the people who were using them already. So they might have something that's maybe a few hundred years old already. So something we would think of as an antique item. So they did have that idea of historical pieces that they would keep. And we try to look at indications of things being kept for a long time. So, for example, if you have a stone bead, it might show signs of extreme wear. So it might be thinned out. The stone might have got so worn that it broke. It might have scratches all over it. It might have been used for such a long time that even a hard stone can get worn right down. And we can say, okay, people have held on to this and kept it. They often recycle the things that they had. So if something breaks, they might smooth off its broken edges and then maybe make a new hole in it. So imagine a broken bead and then you make a new hole in it and try again, keep using it. It doesn't look the same anymore. It might look a bit wonky or, a bit asymmetrical and not exactly perfect anymore. But people will often keep them. So we assume this is an indication of some kind of either sentimental value, they don't want to let go of it, or possibly that it has some kind of property, a bit like the evil eye beads. So maybe they think it brings them luck or protects them in some way, or it has a medicinal value. We know from ethnographic examples that people use these things for medicinal purposes. So you might use them to treat some kind of medical condition and have to keep them somewhere on your body maybe to treat whatever's wrong with you.
That's amazing. Can I ask something specific to the archaeological context? Like, where are these beads or ornaments coming from? Which sites are we talking about? Are we only talking about Turkey when we are talking about the beads and your research, of course? Can you give us a little bit more context?
Okay, yeah, sure. I'm very lucky to work at lots of different sites in Turkey, all the way across. I've worked at sites right across the country. I still work at a lot of sites right across the country. Ornaments were not really a very popular area of study for a long time. Nobody was very excited about them. So a lot of them were just left behind in the excavation archives, totally unstudied, because people used to think, these are just aesthetic stuff. Women use them. We're not going to learn anything from this, whatever. And they got left behind. And so it's been a bit of a struggle to kind of popularize the subject and get excavation directors to take it seriously as an area of study. That's been quite a big change process. But I think it's, quite popular now. And we're trying to get a big picture. So gathering data from lots of different sites with good context. So obviously burials are great because you have ornaments on the human body is the perfect place. You can see how they were used. You can see if it was a necklace, if it was a bracelet, or if it was from clothing, because often people would decorate their clothing, particularly in the earlier periods. Imagine how we sew sequins onto clothes now, maybe onto our best things. You might have a party dress covered in sequins. So people might decorate their clothes with beads, with shells. And we have good evidence that particularly in earlier periods, people did that a lot. So that's why I never use the word jewelry, because it's quite restrictive. And actually, ornamentation is a much broader, it can be anything. You might, pin a badge onto your jumper, or you might have a badge even on your bag or something like this. That's ornamentation too. That's a choice you make about how you look. So, and the idea of this project specifically, so Small Things, Big Stories, is to gather as much really good data as we can from central Turkey and then look at what we can find out about identities in that region, in these very early villages. And why is that an important time? Because life is fundamentally changing for people. So we're talking about a transition from hunter-gatherers who are basically roaming around the landscape seasonally. They don't have permanent homes. They don't have so many possessions. And then they start settling down in these villages, permanent villages, year-round. So they will stay there for 12 months of the year and use the local landscape rather than maybe roaming more broadly. And that changes the way, obviously, they start domesticating plants and animals. So they start what we know as farming, basically. And lifestyles change quite dramatically at that point. And we wanted to see with this project if identities change at the same time and if people start to perceive themselves differently. And if maybe different groups display their identities differently. Until now, we have very little idea of how people were perceived in these early societies. And by that, I mean we don't know much about age differences, gender differences, maybe rites of passage, this kind of thing. So we don't know whether those things existed. We know a lot about burials. So we know who was buried where. Anthropologists have done a lot of work on this, so we do know that. Who was buried where, how old they were when they died, possible causes of death, this kind of thing. But we know much less about how people of different ages were treated. So what was childhood in these early times? What was old age, for example? What's an adult? Because we have very fixed categories, Children, you go to school until you're 18, and then you're an adult, and then, old people, when do you become old? That at some point we classify people as being old and possibly treat them differently accordingly. That's also a bit of a flexible definition, I guess. But we really didn't have a clue about this in the past. There's less old people. Less people live to be very old.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they don't live to be very old at all. So it's interesting to know.
It strikes me as well, like talking about age in Turkey, because, you know, it's very common that people get called like Abi and Abla and things, and it's like that particular moment you go from being Abi to, I don't know, Amja or something. It's like, you know,
It's very
yeah,
true.
very, very stressful, yeah.
There's a whole vocabulary for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which we don't really have in English, so it just shows
No,
that,
it's quite different.
you know, it is culturally
Yeah.
specific.
That's very true.
Speaking of identity, though, can I just pick more at this gender point? Because I think you're right. You know, often, and even the example I used about sort of grandma, you know, is that ornaments are often like highly gendered. And the idea that women normally sort of collect them or put them on their person. Like, do you find something similar in what you're doing, or, you know, is there even, can you talk about like men and ornaments as well, for example? Is that something that comes up?
So something I always do with my students at the beginning of every year is to ask them who uses ornaments, and everybody always says, yeah. Women, females use ornaments. Yeah, that's it. It's jewellery. That's what they do. And then I say, okay, put up your hand if you're wearing any kind of jewellery today, if you have a tattoo, if you dyed your hair, if you're wearing anything at all. And of course, everybody puts up their hand, and then they go, oh, yes, right. It's not. And you find a lot of the male students are wearing earrings, for example. They even forget that they're wearing them at the time when I ask the question. So it's a fun exercise to do. We need to break the gender stereotyping dramatically with this. It's, as I said, it's one of the reasons these objects never got studied in the first place, because they were very much associated with women in the past. Whether that was true or not, it wasn't based on any data, it was just entirely on stereotyping. They were very much based on women in the past, as if it was just women wearing them, therefore, oh, you know, they're not leaders, they're not the important people in society, so we don't need to look at their things. And I mean, that's clearly not true. We have some of the most incredibly decorated graves. I mean, think of Tutankhamun. Everybody, that's the one example everybody knows. This is the most outrageously decorated, ornamented thing that you can possibly imagine. And that's nothing to do with gender. It's to do with the way that people were perceived in society. And also an example I use, Ottoman sultans.
Yeah, right, actually. Yeah.
They used a lot of earrings, a lot of jewels, the amazing turban decorations with brightly coloured feathers and jewels, precious metals. So sort of thinking about it away from gender. And also that's easy to look at because we have historical records. When we get into prehistory, it gets way more difficult. Because while we can tell the sex of skeletons, gender is a whole different question.
It is, yeah.
We don't know how people were perceived in society, how they might have been categorized. There's been a lot of work suggesting there might have been shamans, for example, or similar, practices similar to shamanism. But would they be regarded as, male or female? Was there that kind? Did they have extra categories of people who maybe fell outside of, our stereotypical perceptions? Is something that it's really hard to understand. So we're hoping that our data will help with that a bit, if we can look at who gets buried with what. And at what stage in their lives they get buried with. There's indications already that women change status drastically from their childbearing years into their old age, for example. So they probably change status within society. Whether we call that a gender thing is, disputable, but there's definite differences in the way that people are treated within groups as time passes. We can say things like that.
Yeah. That's fascinating. You mentioned seashells when you were talking about the ornaments, and going back to the prehistoric times, maybe we can talk about a little bit of how these things traveled from one place to another, because we are not only talking about when we are saying seashells, it can also be found in inland, right?
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about the travel?
It's one of the most interesting things. So what happens is, if you think about it, these items that we're talking about, imagine beads, they're very small. So you can easily carry them around, either by wearing them or just by putting them in a pocket or a bag or whatever. You can carry quite a lot of things with you. It's not a big load, like not in the sense of trade where you're carrying big items to be, thinking about food items or pottery or something like that. These are small and can be sort of hidden away somewhere as a sort of side effect of your travel. You can also do some sneaky trade, maybe. And they're one of the most mobile things in the whole archaeological record, which is also something that surprised me when I started working on them, was why nobody had realized that and realized that it's one of the keys to understanding interactions in the past. Because actually, we can see where materials are moving from and to. If we're really lucky, and if there's a workshop area, then we can also find out how they were making them and how they were controlling how they were made. And, if some people had lots of skills and they were really good at it, for example, or if it was just everybody making them in their own houses and just using them. And we often see a combination of those different things together. So shells are always mobile, just like they are today. They were brought from the Mediterranean, normally. And pretty much every settlement of every period has them. They're the most universal thing. So we might think about value and how shells are not really valuable because you just pick them up for free from the seashore, right? Doesn't seem that was the case. So even in the Bronze Age, when people have gold and precious stones and they're decorated, in these amazing colours and all kinds of fancy things, they still use the seashells, which don't look so exciting, but I suspect have some kind of meaning still. So they're still bringing them and using them. We know that for sure. And even so we're talking about people settling down in these villages. So that means, as I said before, they're no longer roaming around the landscape, or they're not all roaming around the landscape. I think that's a better way to put it. They still manage to get the same items that they were using previously. So they find a way to keep their connections to different areas. Those shells are still getting to those people, whether they're getting them themselves or whether there's itinerant traders who are moving between upland and lowland areas, Anatolia, the Anatolian plateau and the Mediterranean. But things are definitely moving around and they're doing it quite deliberately. So they maintain all the ties that they originally had. They keep them somehow, but it's hard to say how. We can't see that bit.
Yeah. Can I ask something actually, which is, so the project is called, so it's Small Things, Big Stories. I repeat that because we had a problem with that. So what about the story side of things, actually? Have you found, what's the most interesting story you found from the objects?
I think the most, I like to think that we're looking from a completely different perspective. So prehistory is traditionally studied from the point of view of material culture, because that's what we have. We look at pottery when it's been invented. We look at stone tools. And that gives a picture of very specific things, mostly economic. So we tend to have these really economic explanations of, people went hunting because they needed food, is a very simple way of putting it, but that's the sort of logic that people use. I think the stories come when we look at things that aren't so necessary. You don't have to have ornaments. You're not going to die if you don't have ornaments. And yet, people make them, and they started making them about 150,000 years ago. So,
I was going to say it's the Oscar Wilde thing, right? It's aesthetics for aesthetics' sake. So, yeah, I think...
There's more to it. Yeah, who knows what drives us to do it? But partly this idea that we're really driven to present ourselves to the world. It's the kind of, saying, I'm me.
Exactly, yeah.
And sometimes that's on an individual level. So you might try to present your own style. And sometimes it's on a group level. So think of when you wear a football kit. Because you're supporting your team. That's you and everybody else who's supporting that team. So you're making yourself part of a group when you do that particular thing. So there's a lot of that in it as well, maybe, that our group identities might be really important.
It's amazing because we tend to think that this, emphasis on being an individual is a very recent thing. However, you carry this into prehistoric times.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking as well when you were talking earlier, I think the comments you make about gender were fascinating. And I was thinking again, like 18th century, fops and things as well. Like even in the UK, there's a similar thing. The more I think about it now.
It's very true. We've slipped into a very strong stereotype. And it's a really recent stereotype, actually.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, if it affects the way we do archaeology quite dramatically, not in a very helpful way. So trying to break that down a bit and look at things with a fresh perspective, I think, has a lot of value.
Absolutely. So another question then was in regards to kind of property. So, often our kind of identities are also attached to property. Do the ornaments that you look at often convey something along these lines as well?
Yeah, again, it's a very difficult thing to identify, but I think one of the things is the idea of these artifact biographies. So when I said we're looking at how long something is used and how long it's held on to, that might be a kind of idea of ownership as well. You're not throwing things away or throwing them in the trash. They have some kind of value. And the idea that belongs to somebody is possibly passed down from one person to another, which we can certainly say for some things. They're used for such a long time that it's more than one generation. So that indicates some kind of maybe ownership. We don't know what ownership means in prehistory. I should add that caveat. Generally, we tend to think that when people start building houses of their own and living in one place, that's the sort of beginning of people saying, this is my place and this is my stuff in a much bigger way. Hunter-gatherers who have very little tend to be maybe less attached to the things that they have. So if a tool breaks, they make a new tool. So there's not so much of that sense of, I need to accumulate things and keep them around me isn't really such a big issue. When you have a house, as we all know, you can fill it up with a lot of things. And it does tend to encourage people to have more stuff because you don't have to carry it around with you all the time. I think there's a big difference there. So the idea of ownership is a debate. What does it even mean? Is there shared ownership? What is an individual? Do people even think of themselves as being individuals within society? Is a very difficult question to answer.
They are even difficult to answer right now.
Yes.
And when you have so little evidence.
It's extremely difficult.
Yeah. And coming back to the evidence, can I ask you, because you are working with really small things, beads are very small and you can tell a lot of stories out of them. But what are some of the techniques that allow you to assess what these beads are and how they were used?
Sure, that's a good question. So we would look, increasingly archaeology has gone into detail. It's the general direction of travel for archaeology. Microscopy is a great thing. It allows us to look at, how much something is worn, but also how it was made. So, for example, the very first drilling technology in the world is invented to make beads.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
the invention of the drill is basically for making ornaments. And so it's, if you think about it that way, it changes your perspective. We have so many technologies attached to ornament making. If you have a bead, you also have to have string to thread it onto, right?
Yeah.
So you can think about it like that and think about the attached technologies. But we can identify what kind of drill might have been used, how they might have shaped the beads. And then through experimental archaeology, which is also part of the project, test how long that would have taken, how much skill you need. We don't have the skills today to do this kind of stuff. You have to learn how to do all these things. It takes time. It's not easy, especially if you have bad eyesight, as I've realised. It's incredibly difficult. Some of the things they made were so tiny that you really have to have, really nimble fingers and a lot of skill to make them. So that's another thing. Technologies are great. And obviously chemical analysis. So we talked about trade. If you want to know where something comes from, you might want to see where the sources of the material are. Certain stones come from certain places. You can assume, for example, that lapis lazuli comes from Afghanistan. It has very restricted sources. Obsidian comes from very restricted volcanic sources. Certain other rocks, not all of them are that easy to work out, but you can get an idea at least where they might have come from. Other technologies like beads that are made, so faience, which is the shaping of, using a certain type of stone, so what we know as soapstone, and then cooking it, possibly coating it in different materials, shaping it. There's a range of technologies associated with that they gradually learn. You have to heat it up. So they start using heating technologies to transform materials, and that eventually brings us glass. So the beginnings of the glass we use today, which we all use all the time, every window, actually come from slightly before the Bronze Age, so about 5,500 years ago, people start experimenting with the technologies that lead to what we have now.
Great.
These are really big stories.
That's
a big story. That's thousands of years.
They're big stories. And I think, we had this big final question for you, but I think I'm just going to sort of bring in something there because I think you've covered some of that in just the last answer. But, we often think about archaeology as this kind of, these big discoveries like, new cities or, I don't know, these huge burials. I mean, you've obviously worked on burials, but, what do you think is, if you have to make a claim for the ornament, if someone's listening, thinking they want to start working on ornaments, I want to start working on ornaments now. What's your pitch?
Okay, elevator pitch for ornaments. Okay, I think they can tell us more than almost any other category of archaeological artifacts about life in the past, because they're more closely associated with the human body than anything else. So they get us closer to people. Almost all of the important technologies that developed in the past were developed in ornaments. So the first metal use in the world ever was in ornaments, because people like experimenting with small things. And if you don't really know what you're doing and you're just having a go at something, then making something really small is a good idea. So the very first use of metal is in ornaments. The beginning of glass technology is in ornaments. Wow. The beginning of drilling technology. I mean, this is pretty fascinating stuff. Absolutely. And there's a lot you can do with it.
And if, as you said earlier, in Turkey, if you have some of the first ever villages and settlements, I mean, that's a huge claim for studying ornaments in Turkey, right?
There's a lot of reason to do it. And I think it's becoming more popular. It's been a long road so far. I've been doing it for quite a while now, I suppose, maybe 15 years. And there are people doing it now. We have a younger generation of people who are interested. So the change is happening, definitely. That's a really positive thing.
Definitely. I'm convinced.
Yeah, I know. I'm never looking at a bead in the same way again. Thanks. Yeah, that was fantastic.
That
Thanks,
was
Emma.
fantastic.
Thanks,
Thank you
Emma.
so
No,
much.
thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I guess what's left to say is keep listening. We should have another episode in 3 to 4 weeks. Also, I just wanted to say thanks to a few of our friends that have been also promoting the podcast. First of all, I know that it's been on Jennifer Hartam's mailing list, which is great. It's just called Istanbul, etc. And also for the Turkey Book Talk podcast as well, for promoting us as well. So, please do listen to those, and thanks very much for their support. But in the meantime, again, thanks very much to Emma, and görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz. Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.